Today's show is going to be about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Pink Floyd. But it's going to be about them in the year 1967. Well, I think that 1967 was the peak year for rock music. I mean, I think it depends on where you come in on the storyline of rock music. But for me, 1967 was it. And for many people, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was the one, certainly of that year, that was the record. But I don't think so. For me, it wasn't my favorite Beatles record of 1967, and I was a huge Beatles fan. But no, the record that came after that, which also came out in 1967, was Magical Mystery Tour, which to me was more what I thought Sgt. Pepper was supposed to be all about, meaning it's psychedelic, it's all these. No, but I think that Magical Mystery Tour is more psychedelic, more experimental, and more interesting musically and sonically. That's just me. And then the Rolling Stones counter to Sgt. Pepper and possibly Magical Mystery Tour was their Satanic Majesty's Request. And that really took the Rolling Stones out of their comfort zone and transformed them into this completely different band, which strangely they themselves weren't too crazy about, and in the years since have done everything they can to put that album down. Satanic Majesties is not Mick or Keith's favorite record. Now, 1967 also saw the release of Pink Floyd's debut album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. By the way, recorded at Abbey Road. I'm going to get into the details a little further in this episode. Oh, and by the way, also later on in this episode, yes, there will be Audiophiliac viewer systems of the day, 2 or 3 or 4 sprinkled in at the very end. Now, listen, I was a kid in 1967, and I was around to fully soak in this experience, to take in these changes that were happening in rapid fire, starting with the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show in the end of 1963, not long after the Kennedy assassination. So I was in the prime seat to just experience all of this. So the Beatles were, let's just face it, the Beatles were the ones. They were leading the pack. I mean, they were even bigger. I know it's hard to imagine. They were even bigger than Taylor Swift is now. And they were that important to us. Anyway, I'm just kidding around. But anyway, 67 was such an incredible year for music. And not just the Beatles and the Stones and Pink Floyd. Here's a list of albums that I bought in 1967 that I still treasure. The Velvet Underground and Nico, well, it didn't sound like 1967. It sounded like 1975. But I didn't know that in 1967. And it kind of blew my mind. Love. So Love's Forever Changes. I liked the record, but I didn't get it until many years later. I didn't realize that it was definitely on par with Sgt. Pepper and Pet Sounds and the best stuff of 1967. Now, the Doors' first album, Light My Fire, yeah, I was 100% in. I was an instant Doors fan, and that came out in 1967, and also the second Doors album, Strange Days. Both absolutely phenomenal then, and they absolutely hold up. Jimi Hendrix's first record, Are You Experienced, was off the charts, just blew my mind over and over again. And the second record, Axis Bold as Love, also released in 67, both perfect 10s. The Cream Disraeli Gears, that kind of dense wall of sound, yes, absolutely staggering. Now, the Moody Blues Days of Future Past, I like that record, but the orchestral parts of it, I don't know, it wasn't really, but over the years, it's definitely grown. But I'm so glad I bought it in 1967. Jefferson Airplane's Surrealistic Pillow, oh yeah, I saw the Airplane a couple times in the 60s, and wow, what an amazing live band. And I think their studio albums are just as good. And then there's Procol Harum's first album, the one with A Whiter Shade of Pale. Just again, just so incredible then, one that you just played on repeat over and over again, and all these years later, still blows my mind. And finishing up the list of records that I bought in 1967 is Bob Dylan's John Wesley Harding. Yeah, this was like another phase of Bob Dylan. He kept pushing his audience to accept him in his new guise. You know, he just kept evolving and evolving. And when this record came out, you know, it wasn't Highway 61 Revisited. It wasn't, but it still was pretty freaking amazing. So I get these records, I run home with them, and I play them on my stereo. I was really into stereo, by the way. I love stereo. Anyway, when I heard Sgt. Pepper, the stereo mix, my jaw was on the floor. It was nothing like that had ever happened. It was just, there's another world there. How do these two speakers make this big sound? And the people that prefer the mono mix of Sgt. Pepper, you know, if that's your thing, that's your thing. But it was, and especially over headphones, listening to Sgt. Pepper over headphones was an experience. It still is, actually, because it sort of broke through some kind of barrier about what stereo could be. I do want to quickly mention the cover art. Now, Sgt. Pepper's cover is amazing. It really is. And when that record came out, everybody was abuzz as to who are all those people? Who is that guy over there? Who's that one over there? Yeah, it's really, really good. But you know what? I think the cover for the Stones record, Satanic Majesties, that's a whole different thing, man. It's called lenticular, that thing on the cover that makes it look 3D and how you see different views. I think if the Stones were trying to top the Beatles, I think they succeeded. But you know what? That could just be me. Now the cover for The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, that's a cool cover, but it's not in the league of the other covers I just mentioned. Now I just want to take a second to put some perspective on where we're going in this story. Because when Sgt. Pepper's came out in June 1967, I think that's the date, the Beatles had already stopped touring, which was a pretty radical move for a rock band in 1967. Everybody was touring, that was the whole idea. But the Beatles said, no, we want to spend more time in the studio perfecting our art. And they did. I mean, Revolver, the album before Sgt. Pepper, was pretty darn extraordinary. But Sgt. Pepper took it to another level. And I love that record, I truly do. But people talked about it being a psychedelic album, you know, it was very spacey and druggy and all that stuff. Not for me, I didn't think so. But when Magical Mystery Tour came out, I thought, no, this is what I thought Sgt. Pepper was supposed to be. This kind of advanced, psychedelic, state-of-the-art recording, new sounds, all that stuff. And it was. But when Magical Mystery Tour came out, I thought, yes, that's it. Now, I just want to take a little pause for a second to point out that Magical Mystery Tour in the UK was released as a double EP, two 7-inch records, and those records had 6 tracks. When Magical Mystery Tour was released in the United States, it was released as an LP with 11 tracks. And the way it was divided was the first side of the LP were the EP tracks. I'm showing you right now what that looks like. And then side 2 were basically singles and B-sides. And to me, I didn't know that in 1967 when I bought Magical Mystery Tour buying the LP. But that kind of works as a whole, and it actually works so well that once, as the years went by, the EP went away, and it was only the US version of Magical Mystery Tour, the 11-track LP and then CD. But, you know, Strawberry Fields is probably the ultimate John Lennon song. It is so beautiful and deep and emotional and sad and probing. It's just beautiful. And the sound of that recording and how it's mixed and how his voice is processed and stuff, it's just a masterpiece. Penny Lane, a Paul song, it's very Paul, but again, it's actually Paul's answer, I believe, to Strawberry Fields Forever, because John and Paul were very competitive about trying to keep moving it forward. Again, they just kept doing it over and over and over again on Magical Mystery Tour. And then John's I Am the Walrus. is beyond a day in the life. I think it's just so advanced. It was so advanced then, it still sounds that way. How did they do that very complex mix on a 4-track machine in 1967? It's just thrilling. I mean, I get goosebumps every time I play I Am a Walrus. For me, and this is all my opinion, right? I think that All You Need Is Love, which was recorded almost completely live in the studio for the television broadcast, that is epic. I also want to mention Baby You're a Rich Man, which is so funny because you could just imagine people saying to the 4 Beatles how rich they were. You know, how does it feel to be one of the beautiful people? It's almost like they're reflecting back their experience to their audience. Yes, this is what it's like to be a rich man. So now I want to talk about Satanic Majesty's Request, which I have always loved. I loved it when I bought it in 1967. It was a great record to me. It still is. It has aged very, very well. But unfortunately, the Rolling Stones themselves don't particularly like this record. And I think that might be because it has Brian Jones, the second guitar player in the original version of the band. It has his fingerprints all over it because he was the one that liked using exotic instruments and trying different things, and he was the most experimental. And he got his way to make this record, but the band themselves didn't like it. They didn't like making the record, partially because, as I've read, they weren't all in the studio at the same time for most of the tracks. So that could affect how they feel about the record. But I don't have that baggage. I could just listen to it, enjoy it, and enjoy that the Stones became basically a different version of themselves, far more than the Beatles ever did with, Sgt. Pepper. The Stones transformed themselves into this more psychedelic band than certainly the Beatles ever were. And I think that deserves some praise, and that's what I'm doing right now. By the way, the single, I'm pretty sure, She's a Rainbow, She Comes in Colors, was the obvious single. I'm sure they were desperate to have something that they could put out as a single. And it's a great song. And the background, by the way, and the ooh-la-las and all that stuff, it sounds like they were inspired by Paul and John's backing vocals on some song. So anyway, I love the record. I love it for its weirdness, and I love the stereo imaging on this record. It's so advanced for its time. There's a lot of textures and sounds and percussion and strings and brass all over this record. There's a lot going on, and the way it all comes out in this beautifully layered mix was amazing for 1967. So now I want to cover Pink Floyd's Piper at the Gates of Dawn. The first Pink Floyd record, which was basically Syd Barrett's record. This was before Roger Waters came to be the head guy. Syd Barrett was in it. He wrote most of the music on Piper at the Gates of Dawn. It's a different band, possibly because Roger was, let's say, just the bass player then. Now, mind you, this album was recorded at Abbey Road, same studio as that the Beatles were using, and it was produced by Norman Smith. Now, Norman Smith was, up until just before this album was recorded, the Beatles' recording engineer. Norman Smith was the engineer for all Beatles albums up to and including Rubber Soul. So he left just as the Beatles were starting Revolver. And he left specifically with a mission. That is, he wanted to produce this new and upcoming band, Pink Floyd. And the fact that Norman Smith, who spent those years with the Beatles crafting the Beatles sound, created an entirely different sound with Pink Floyd in the same studio. And mind you, remember, this is 1967. The possibilities of how to manipulate sound in a studio were very, very limited in 1967. They were recording on 4-track analog tape machines, but yet Pink Floyd is coming from a different universe than what happened with the Beatles. That is extraordinary. And when I heard in 1967 Interstellar Overdrive, my ears were pinned back by that sound. We were in the future. We were going way past what was happening in 1967, at least in the world of 1967 rock music that I was aware of. So anyway, it was incredibly exciting to hear Pink Floyd And I've said in other videos that I was a big fan of Pink Floyd up to Dark Side of the Moon. Once they got to Dark Side of the Moon, I started to lose interest. Even The Wall didn't really grab me. No, I like the early, very experimental Pink Floyd. And they were certainly pushing the limits on their very first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn. And that's it. Now, of course, I want to hear about your feelings about the Beatles and the Stones and Pink Floyd in this mix, in specifically 1967. And, well, who are your favorites of that time period of 1967? I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. But now we're going to do a little taste sampler of Audiophiliac viewer systems of the day. This is Evan's system. He's a 21-year-old college student who's definitely an audiophile. Now his turntable is an Oracle Delphi Mark I with a Shure V15 Type 4 cartridge. Preamp, Threshold SL10, Power Amp, Threshold Stasis 2. CD transport is a Meridian 200, DAC Shit Modius. And the speakers, those big speakers, are Infinity Kappa 8s. But here's the thing, he's also about to get Martin Logan Monolith 1s. Good going, Evan. Check out Stuart's system. He lives in Devon, UK. His turntable is a Reloop Turn 5 with a Nagaoka MP200 cartridge. For digital, a squeeze box that runs into a Chord Mojo DAC. The amplifier is an Audio Innovations S300 ECL86. It's a 10-watt tube amp. As for the speakers, I've never seen anything like this before. These are Tannoy GRF copies with a 15-inch Eminence choral compression mid. And then there's also a Les Cleach horn and choral tweeters. Stuart, all I can say is, wow. Dylan is a headphone guy. He lives in Minnesota, and this is his system. Turntable is a U-turn Orbit Theory. Cartridge, Grado Opus 3. Phono stage is a Hegeman Bugle MC. Headphone amplifier, JDS Labs Atom Amp 2. And there's two sets of headphones, Hi-Fi Man Sundera and the Maze 99 Noir. Thanks, Dylan. All right, we are back. My name is Steve Guttenberg, and I am the Audiophiliac. And if you like these kinds of shows where I'm sort of breaking the mold here of what I do on this channel, please consider joining and supporting my work through my Patreon. The address is on the screen right now. You can join for just a couple of bucks a month, or up to 50 or 100, and in those top two tiers, you and I will have a conversation every month at the beginning of the month. There's more information on the Patreon site. But if you'd like to just subscribe to this channel, if you have yet to do so, as we're getting very, very close to 250,000 subscribers, and if you like a given video, please give me a thumbs up. And with that, I can say my work here is at last complete. Thank you again for watching. Hope to see you back here again very, very soon. Bye-bye.